Hey everyone, my name is Ann Yost and thank you for watching my presentation. Today I am walking you through my full research project and explaining what I learned about how living in poverty influences the likelihood of being labeled as deviant. This topic ended up being more meaningful to me than I expected because once I started collecting data and reviewing research, I realized just how often poverty is treated like some kind of personal flaw rather than a social condition. In this presentation, I will take you through my research question, the literature review I built, my research method, my data collection process, the patterns that stood out to me, and the sociological theories that fit these patterns. I will also share a biblical perspective because looking at this topic through a Christian lens really changes how we interpret deviance and social judgment. My goal is to give you a clearer picture of how deviant labeling works and to show why this matters for real people who live in poverty every day. I chose this topic because I kept noticing how people would talk negatively about poverty, especially on social media. Even when the original post was neutral or just someone asking for help, the comments were full of assumptions. People mostly blamed the individual right away, even when they had no information at all. It stood out to me about how fast poverty turns into a label. Goad talks about how deviance is created through reactions, not just through behavior. That idea made me want to dig deeper into the way society reacts to people experiencing poverty. I also chose this topic because I work with financial information at my job, and I see how hard people try to stay afloat. It never feels as simple as just a good choice or a bad choice. So this project became personal too. I wanted to understand how deviant labels form and why poverty gets linked to shame and blame so often. This topic is important because deviant labeling shapes real lives. When people assume that someone living in poverty is irresponsible or lazy, it affects how they are treated in schools, hospitals, workplaces, and courts. It affects whether people feel safe asking for help, and it affects how people see themselves. Poverty stigma is powerful. Once someone gets labeled, that label sticks. Goad calls this secondary deviance when the label becomes part of the identity. That idea shapes a lot of how I looked at the data. The comments I read were full of judgment, and that judgment can influence opportunities like hiring decisions, access to resources, and even just basic respect. So this is not just a theoretical topic. It affects the daily lives and dignity of many people. The research question I focused on was simple but important. How does living in poverty influence the likelihood of being labeled as deviant? This question helped me stay focused while I reviewed the research and collected my own data. Instead of looking at all forms of deviance, I stayed focused on the process of labeling. This main question points towards deviance as something created socially, not something that automatically exists in a person or their actions. It also points towards power, because labeling usually comes from people or institutions with more authority. Keeping this question in the back of my mind helped me understand the difference between actual behavior and the assumptions that people make. My literature review ended up falling into three major themes. The first one was poverty stigma, which showed up across multiple studies. This theme included the emotional, mental, and social effects of being judged because of economic status. The second theme was policing and surveillance. This one focused on the way poor communities face more police contact and more suspicion. The third theme was structural inequality, which explains how deviance label continues across generations. These themes connected closely with class, power, and social reactions. They helped me get a better understanding that deviant labeling is not random or based on evidence. It follows the structure of society. People with fewer resources ended up being judged more harshly, and the research just shows that being supported again and again. The first theme was focusing on poverty stigma. Inglis and the other authors found that stigma creates stress, isolation, and even shame. This connects right back to the idea that deviance comes from reactions because judgment itself creates harm. Lieb and colleagues found that mothers with low incomes felt mental strain and struggled with basic needs when they were judged for their poverty. Letty and her team found that poverty stigma even affected health outcomes for women living with HIV. That was super important because it shows that stigma is not just limited to feelings. It directly affects someone's survival. Tyler and Campbell describe poverty stigma as something that keeps poverty alive. They said it works almost like glue. That idea helped me understand why deviance labeling is so powerful. If people are constantly blamed for their poverty, it becomes harder for them to ask for help or gain access to resources. These studies help me connect poverty stigma with deviant labeling because both involve attaching a negative meaning to someone's whole identity. The second theme in the research focuses on policing and surveillance. Konja Mon and her team found that homeless individuals experience repeated and sometimes unnecessary police contact. This repeated contact creates a deviant label whether or not they actually did anything wrong. Suss and Oliveira found that stop and search practices were concentrated in poor areas, which made these communities appear more deviant simply because they were watched more closely. Peterson and Wiesberg found a similar pattern with police stops in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Lofstrom and Raphael connected the justice system to inequality, showing how the system itself reinforces deviant labels across class lines. These studies showed me that deviant labeling does not only come from individuals. Sometimes it comes from the structure of policing. When poorer communities face more surveillance, they also face more suspicion. And over time, that creates a social image of deviance. The third theme focused on structural inequality. Smith and his colleagues found that young people who were criminalized early faced major economic challenges later in life. Once someone is labeled as deviant during adolescence, they face fewer opportunities, worse job prospects, and more social barriers. This shows how deviance labeling gets passed through systems. This idea helped me understand that deviance is not always about a specific event. Sometimes it is about the way society organizes resources. If a group faces fewer opportunities and more surveillance, then labeling becomes predictable. It's not just a random phenomenon, it's part of a larger social pattern. I chose content analysis because I needed a method that let me observe labeling as it actually happens. Interviews or surveys would have changed the way people responded. Online spaces show real reactions in real time. People feel more comfortable saying what they really think behind a screen, even if it is harsh. Another reason I chose this method is it allowed me to gather a large amount of material quickly. One interview would not show me the patterns I needed, but hundreds of comments across multiple platforms gave me a wide range of reactions. Everything I used was public, so there were no ethical issues or privacy concerns. Content analysis ended up being the best fit for my question because it let me study the social reaction in its natural setting. For my data collection, I spent 3 hours across Reddit, TikTok, and news comment sections. Each platform had a different tone, which helped me see the patterns more clearly. Reddit had long arguments and debates. TikTok had shorter, very much more emotional comments, and news comment sections had political discussions that turned into arguments over responsibility and morality. As I read through comments, I sorted them in categories. Moral judgment was the most common by far. Criminal assumptions showed up often too, even when the original post never mentioned crime. Blame showed up in many forms. I had categories for supportive comments and systematic explanations. Those appeared sometimes, but they were pretty rare. That stood out to me because it showed that most people do not see poverty as a structural issue. Walking into this, I expected judgment, but I did not expect how quickly comments shifted from poverty to criminal assumptions. People would say things like the person must be on drugs, they were scamming the system, even when there was no evidence. This was one of the hardest parts of the research because it reminded me how far society has to go when understanding poverty. It was also challenging emotionally. Reading harsh comments for hours felt heavy, especially when these comments are directed at people who are already struggling. But this emotional reaction I had also helped me understand the human side of deviant labeling. These labels aren't just words you're speaking to someone. They affect the way the person is treated and the opportunities that they have. My main finding was that poverty itself is treated as deviant, even without any specific behavior. People jump to conclusions that poor individuals are lazy or irresponsible. Many comments also assumed criminal behavior. I found this across all 3 platforms. Only a small number of comments mentioned things like low wages, medical debt, housing prices, or lack of opportunity. Instead, the large majority blamed the individuals. This matched what I also saw in the research. Poverty stigma is strong, and deviant labeling follows naturally from it. It showed me that deviance is often created long before any behavior even happens. These findings connect directly to the theories we studied in class. Labeling theory was the most obvious. People get labeled based on assumptions, and these labels shape how others see them. Secondary deviance was present whenever people internalize these labels or face long-term consequences from them. Conflict theory was also important. This theory explains how those with more power create definitions of deviance that protect their interests. Poor communities face more surveillance, more judgment, and fewer opportunities. That lines up exactly with conflict theory. These theories help me understand that deviant labeling is part of a larger social structure. A Christian view changes how we think about deviance and poverty. Scripture teaches us not to judge based on appearance or status. Proverbs tell us to speak up for the poor and defend their rights. Jesus teaches us in Matthew that what we do for those in need, we do for him. James reminds us not to show favoritism or look down on someone because of their situation. When I compare these Bible verses with the reactions I saw online, the difference was stark. Social stigma blames people for their poverty. The Bible calls us to compassion. It calls us to see every person with dignity. This perspective helped me understand why deviant labeling can be harmful and why empathy is so important. One thing I wanted to include before closing is the bigger picture of what this all actually means for society. The more I worked on this project, the more I realized that labeling does not stop with comments online. It influences how schools, workplaces, hospitals, and even government agencies treat people. When someone is labeled as irresponsible or lazy because of their poverty, they may be denied help or receive less empathy. These labels shape decisions about hiring, housing, and even medical treatment. There are also policy implications. If society believes that poverty comes from personal failure, then many people oppose safety net programs, wage increases, or expanded access to health care. But if we understand that poverty is connected to stigma, lack of opportunity, and structural inequality, then we begin to see why support systems are necessary and why judgment does not solve anything. Recognizing how deviance gets assigned helps us understand the real causes of inequality instead of placing blame on individuals. This project helped me understand how important it is to question the labels we attach to people and how much harm they can cause when we use them without thinking. I also wanted to reflect on what I learned personally through this project because it ended up changing how I see deviance and how I understand poverty. At the start, I already knew that people sometimes make harsh comments, but I did not realize how consistent and predictable the patterns were. Seeing the same stereotypes over and over across different platforms made it clear that stigma is not random. It is part of a larger social script that people repeat without thinking. Another thing that surprised me was how emotionally heavy the research felt at times. Reading comments where people were judged or blamed for their struggles made me think about how common these experiences must be for anyone living in poverty. Before doing this project, I had not fully considered how exhausting it must be to face these assumptions daily. In conclusion, poverty increases deviant labeling through stigma, policing, and structural inequality. My data supported everything I saw in the research and everything we learned from GOAD. It showed me that deviance is not simply about behavior. It is about how society reacts and who has the power to define deviance. From a Christian lens, this pushes us to treat people with care and fairness. Instead of just attaching shame or blame, we should be focusing on compassion and justice. This project gave me a deeper understanding of how deviance works and how much impacting labeling has on real lives. These are my references I used. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great day.